The Galactic Defense Institute had a saying, scratched into the obsidian archway above its main entrance, translated into 412 languages, visible to every recruit who walked through those doors on their first day. Strength is not given. It is survived. Nobody had ever explained that saying to Lieutenant Commander Vorax Thessian of the Krelthi Dominion. Nobody needed to. He had read it 347 times, and every single time he had nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed those words were written specifically about his species. He was, by every measurable standard, an extraordinary specimen. 7 feet of dense, ridge-plated muscle, 4 arms, each capable of bending durasteel piping with casual effort, twin respiratory systems that could filter toxic atmospheres, and a nervous system so redundant that losing 2 of his 6 major nerve clusters would barely inconvenience him. The Krelthi had evolved on a world where the gravity was twice galactic standard, where acid storms rolled in every 3 rotations, where the dominant predators had no concept of mercy, and neither did the prey. And here, standing in the orientation bay of the most elite military training program in the known galaxy, Vorax Thessian looked at the newest batch of recruits and started doing what he always did. He started judging. There was Dozum Real, the 10th from the ammonia cloud worlds. Tall, elegant, 6-limbed, with a bioluminescent throat sac that pulsed nervously blue. Competent. Vorax had seen her type before. They were fast, clever, and dissolved in water, which was always an interesting weakness to have in a galaxy that was, statistically speaking, quite wet. There was Ogun Halfmast. Yes, that was actually his name. Nobody was going to address that. A massive Torvali ground soldier with a jaw wide enough to bite a hover cycle in half. He would do fine. Vorax had trained with Torvali before. They were basically a species that had weaponized stubbornness. There was Pilar Ven, a Gathosi intelligence specialist, small and wiry, who moved like every hallway was a potential ambush and never sat with her back to anything. Smart, paranoid, useful. There was Ket, who gave only one name, because Ket's species communicated primarily through pressure waves, and the translator had given up after the first syllable. Ket looked like someone had taken a boulder and decided it deserved opinions. And then there was the human. She had walked in with the others, which seemed statistically improbable to Vorax, because he had expected something larger, or louder, or at minimum something that looked less like a strong wind might end her career. She was shorter than Doza Muriel by a full head. She had no visible armor plating, no reinforced exoskeleton, no redundant organ systems that he could detect, and he had a very good eye for biology after 3 decades in interstellar service. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 respiratory system, and a face that was, if Vorax was being charitable, completely unintimidating. Her name, according to the roster, was Sergeant First Class Muriel Okafor Strand. Homeworld, Earth. Specialty, Survival Operations and Tactical Endurance. Vorax read Survival Operations and Tactical Endurance and thought about what that actually meant coming from a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century. He thought about their soft skin, their fragile bones, their reliance on a very narrow band of temperature and pressure and oxygen concentration. He thought about the fact that humans slept, actually lost consciousness for 1/3 of every cycle, and needed to do so, or they started hallucinating. He looked at Muriel Okafor Strand. She looked back at him with the flat, neutral expression of someone filling out administrative paperwork. Vorax turned to Captain Sunru Alathi, the program's intake coordinator, who was standing beside him reviewing digital manifests and deliberately not meeting his eyes because she knew what he was about to say and had apparently decided not to participate. She will not last 1 day in the Deathworld track, Vorax said, not quietly. The orientation bay had excellent acoustics. This was noted. Mireille Okafor Strand did not react. She continued standing at rest, hands clasped behind her back, eyes forward, looking at the far wall with the serene patience of someone who had been told far worse things by far more qualified people, and had apparently filed all of those opinions in the same place. Sunru Alathi did not look up from her manifest. Noted, Lieutenant Commander. Do you want to put something in writing, or are you comfortable with the informal wager? I do not wager, Vorax said. I have observed this species at length. Their physiology is— We're on a schedule, Alathi said pleasantly. The Deathworld survival track was not, technically, named after any specific planet. It was a composite program, a rotating gauntlet of simulated environments taken from the 12 most biologically hostile worlds in the Galactic Survey database, cycling through them in 72-hour intervals with no recovery time between transitions. The environments included a low-oxygen, high-particulate atmosphere modeled on the dust fields of Keth-4, a hyper-humidity biome from the jungles of Savarine, a high-radiation surface exposure simulation from the tidally locked day side of Mura's third moon, a seismic instability track, a sub-zero thermal endurance sequence, and at the end, a combined scenario that layered 4 of the previous environments simultaneously and asked recruits to extract a simulated casualty over 3 kilometers of hostile terrain. It had a 41% completion rate. For humans, historically, the completion rate was 0, not because they had never tried. 2 had in the program's history. The first had been medically withdrawn after the third environment with a core temperature event. The second had completed 4 of the 6 environments before a hyperventilation cascade in the low oxygen sequence had taken him out. Both had been decorated veterans on their homeworld. Vorax knew all of this. He also knew that Muriel Okafor Strand had somehow scored in the 94th percentile on the written entrance evaluation, which he had attributed to humans being theoretically clever in controlled low-stress environments, which was not a skill that helped when you were wading through Savarine-level humidity, carrying 60 kilograms of gear. Day 1 of the Deathworld track started with Keth-4. Keth-4's atmosphere was 70% nitrogen, 18% particulate matter of varying chemical composition, and just enough oxygen to technically qualify as breathable, if you had a generous definition of breathable and a tolerant relationship with your own respiratory system. Most species required partial filtration gear. The Senth Doza Muriel was exempt. She had 6 separate filtration nodes along her gill slits and actually commented, mildly, that the air reminded her of a vacation. Vorax observed from the monitoring station. He was not an active recruit, he was a supervising officer on temporary training attachment, and watched the feed as the 6-person cohort moved through the particulate field. Ket, the boulder that had decided to have opinions, was fine, obviously. Ket was made of something harder than most arguments. Ogun Halfmast was coughing but mobile, his massive frame pushing through the orange haze with the grim momentum of a geological event. Pilar Ven had jury-rigged her filtration gear in the first 10 minutes to increase its efficiency by a claimed 30%, which the monitoring AI flagged as unauthorized modification, and which Vorax decided to evaluate after seeing if it actually worked. It appeared to, and Muriel Okafor Strand was walking, just walking. Steady pace. Equipment checks every 4th step, he counted. With the mechanical regularity of someone who had done this so many times, the rhythm had become unconscious. Her filtration gear was standard issue, unmodified, and her oxygen saturation readings on the biometric feed were— Vorax checked the feed twice. 96%. That was not possible. That was better than Ogun's readings, and Ogun had twice the lung capacity by volume. Vorax looked at the atmospheric sensor to confirm the simulation was running correctly. It was. He looked at the biometric feed again. 96%. Steady. He pulled her intake file and found, buried in the physical assessment section, a notation he had apparently skimmed past during his initial review. It read, "Subject has documented hypoxic conditioning history, extensive high-altitude and low-pressure exposure protocol. Effective oxygen efficiency significantly above species baseline." Vorax stared at this for a moment. He then looked up what high-altitude conditioning meant for humans specifically, and found that there was an entire practice, an entire voluntary, intentional practice, where humans went to places with insufficient oxygen and simply stayed there until their bodies adapted. Not because they had to, not as a survival necessity. because it made them better at things later. He sat with that for a moment. They do this recreationally, he said, to no one in particular. Ilathi, who had been reading at the adjacent station and had clearly been waiting, said, without looking up, some of them do it for fun. The transition to the second environment, the Savarine humidity simulation, happened at hour 22. This was where Vorax had been certain the human would break. The Savarine jungle sequence was designed to be miserable, 60 kilograms of moisture per cubic meter of air, temperatures that sat at the precise edge of dangerous for most warm-blooded species, fungi and microorganism simulants that colonized gear and skin and anything organic that stayed still for more than a few minutes. It was the environment that had eliminated the most recruits in program history, not because it killed quickly, but because it degraded everything, focus, morale, physical function, in such a slow and comprehensive way that most beings reached a point where continuing stopped feeling like a rational choice. Vorax watched the cohort enter the biome. Doza Muriel immediately began having problems. Her bioluminescent sac went from nervous blue to distressed yellow as the moisture levels registered on her biology. She was not in danger, but she was uncomfortable in the particular way that a being becomes uncomfortable when the environment is actively trying to absorb them. Ogon Halfmast started sweating through his equipment within the first hour, which in a Toravali was technically a sign of overheating, which at Toravali scale meant the monitoring AI quietly elevated his alert status and assigned additional attention. Pilar Ven was not visibly suffering, which was impressive, but she had gone extremely quiet. And quiet with Gathosi typically meant processing intensive discomfort. Mireille Okafor Strand was wet. She was, within 20 minutes comprehensively, entirely, soaked through every layer of gear. And she appeared to have decided this was fine. She moved with the same steady cadence as the previous environment. Equipment checks every fourth step, no hesitation, no adaptation break. Her core temperature readings were elevated. She was warm, clearly, but within the functional band. Her biometrics showed elevated sweat response, which the monitoring AI helpfully noted was a human thermoregulation mechanism, which Vorax had known academically but was now watching in real time as her body apparently just managed. At hour 31, the cohort reached the extraction objective, a simulated casualty represented by a weighted platform, and was required to move it to the designated egress point, 2 kilometers through the biome. The weighted platform massed 200 kilograms. Ogun Halfmast picked up one end. He was the obvious choice. He was a Toravali ground soldier, and this was approximately what they were designed for. The question was who took the second handle. Ket, the geological opinion boulder, extended what could generously be called a limb, and Mireille Okafor Strand walked to the second handle, set her grip, looked at Ogun across the platform, and said, in the clipped, flat tone of someone confirming a logistical arrangement, "Call the pace." Ogun blinked his 4 eyes at her. He had, Vorax suspected, not expected to be the one setting the pace. "Left foot," Ogun said after a pause. "Ready," said Mireille. They moved. Vorax watched the carry from the monitoring feed for the full duration. He watched Mireille's biometrics climb, heart rate elevated, oxygen consumption up, every indicator showing a system working at near capacity, and stay there, not spiking, not crashing, not plateauing and then failing, just sustaining. The same way a machine sustains. Except it wasn't a machine, it was a small, wet, soft-skinned being from a planet that had, as far as Vorax knew, not even been aware that the galaxy had neighbors for most of its history, moving 200 kilograms of dead weight through simulated jungle conditions at hour 31 of a 72-hour track with 4 more environments remaining. They completed the carry in 47 minutes. Vorax did not say anything. Elathi, at the adjacent station, also said nothing. But there was something about the quality of her silence that was deeply, insufferably satisfied. The transition to Environment 3 came at hour 44, and Vorax had by this point stopped making predictions out loud. He had not stopped making them internally. He had simply learned, in the last 22 hours, to hold them quietly until reality had a chance to humiliate them first. Environment 3 was the radiation surface sequence, Mura's third moon, tidally locked, dayside only, a baked and scoured expanse of superheated rock under a radiation index that made most species biology start filing formal complaints within the first hour. The simulation ran it at 60% of actual Mura surface intensity, which the program designers had apparently considered merciful, and which still meant that every recruit required full-spectrum shielding gear and a radiation counter that would alarm if cumulative exposure crossed into the concern threshold. The gear was standard issue. It was the same for everyone. Doza Mariel went in with her bioluminescent sac, now a deep, stressed amber, which on the Senth color scale meant something between "I am reassessing my life choices" and "I would like to speak to someone in administration." She was functional. She was not happy. Ogun Half-Mast had stopped sweating, which for a Torvali in high heat was actually a bad sign, and the monitoring AI elevated his status again and dispatched an automated cooling advisory to his suit systems. Pilar Ven had somehow acquired, between environments, a secondary radiation filter of uncertain origin, which she had attached to her primary gear with what appeared to be connector pins from her communication array. When Alathi noticed and flagged it, Pilar responded through the comms that she had not modified her issued gear, she had merely added to it, and that these were technically different things. Alathi had stared at the screen for a long moment and then written "noted" in the log, because there were battles worth having and battles worth documenting for later. Mirail Okafor Strand entered the radiation sequence and did something that Vorax noticed only because he had, by this point, started watching her specifically. She slowed down, not stopped, not retreated. She reduced her pace to approximately 70% of what she had been running in the previous environments, and she began moving differently. Lower center of gravity, shorter steps, more deliberate weight distribution. Vorax pulled up the terrain analysis for the Mura surface simulation and saw what she had apparently already processed. The superheated rock surface was not uniform. There were variance gradients, patches where the simulation had modeled actual thermal topography, where certain surfaces radiated more intensely upward and certain shadow zones from ridge features offered fractional protection. She was navigating the radiation field, not the safe path. There was no safe path. This was the point. But the less bad path. The path that accumulated exposure more slowly, bought time, preserved function. Vorax watched her radiation counter, and watched the counters of the others, and by the 1-hour mark she was running the lowest cumulative exposure reading in the cohort, including Pilar Ven with her improvised secondary filter. Vorax pulled her file again. He went looking this time, specifically, not skimming. He found a training record that covered, among other things, 18 months of documented field operations in what the human military designation called high-threat environmental zones. He found a commendation notation for exceptional terrain utilization under sustained fire. He found, further down, a personal statement she had written for the Institute application, which candidates were required to submit, and which Vorax had not read because he read personal statements after deciding whether a candidate was worth the investment of attention, which was a system that was currently experiencing a quality control issue. The statement was 4 sentences. I was told my species was not suited for this program. I was told this by someone who had never watched a human work. I am applying because I want to be useful, and because I have found that most environments considered inhospitable are simply environments nobody bothered to learn. I intend to learn them. Vorax read it twice. Then he put his file down and watched the feed in silence. Environment 4 was seismic instability, a simulation of a tectonically active zone modeled on the fault networks of Grathon Minor, where the ground moved with the arbitrary creative energy of a planet that had never been informed it was supposed to stay still. Tremors ran in unpredictable cycles. Fissures opened and closed. Entire sections of terrain shifted vertical orientation without consulting anyone about their plans. This was where Ket, the geological boulder entity with opinions, became genuinely impressive. Ket moved through seismic instability the way most beings moved through flat terrain, with total indifference to the ground's antics, because Ket's species had evolved on a world that considered earthquakes a mild weather event. Ket was also, Vorax observed, quietly making sure other cohort members didn't fall into things, extending limbs at key moments with the casual protectiveness of someone who had decided, at some point, that this group was now their problem. Doza Muriel was struggling. Her six-limbed frame was actually a liability here. More contact points with a surface that kept rearranging itself. More opportunities for an unexpected fissure to catch a limb at the wrong angle. She was moving carefully, which was smart, but carefully in a seismic environment still meant accepting a lot of involuntary course corrections. Ogun had recovered from his heat stress and was now doing what Torvali did when the situation removed the possibility of strategy, which was plant his feet and refuse to be moved by anything short of a direct structural argument with physics. He was not graceful. He was, however, still there, which in seismic terrain counted for a great deal. Mira Okafor Strand was moving like the ground was not her enemy. She was moving like the ground was information. Every tremor she used, not resisted, not compensated for, but incorporated, adjusting her vector mid-step so that the seismic energy moved through her rather than against her. Vorax had seen this technique in theoretical documentation. It was a concept in advanced kinetics training called compliant motion, and it was fiendishly difficult to execute because it required processing environmental feedback faster than conscious thought. It was usually taught as a graduate-level skill. He had not seen it in the field from a being who had at this point been awake and under continuous environmental stress for 58 hours. She also caught Doza Muriel. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement. Doza's forward left limb found a fissure edge at exactly the wrong angle, and Marile was close enough, moving in the right direction already, to get a grip on Doza's equipment harness and redistribute the fall into a controlled stumble rather than a full drop. Doza recovered, checked herself, pulsed a quick grateful green through her sac, and kept moving. Mirel kept moving too. Vorax said to Elathi. She anticipated that. Elathi said. Yes, she was already moving into position before the fissure opened. Yes, Vorax thought about this. She is reading the seismic patterns. She's been reading them since the environment started, Elathi said, in the tone of someone who had been watching this with significant personal satisfaction and had been waiting for him to catch up. Her positioning relative to the other cohort members has been non-random since hour 3 of this environment. She's been running a protective perimeter without telling anyone she was running a protective perimeter. Vorax looked at the feed. He looked at Mirail's position relative to Doza, relative to Ogun, relative to Pilar. He mapped her movement decisions backward through the recorded feed for 20 minutes. Elathi was correct. She did not volunteer this information to her cohort, Vorax said. No, why not? Elathi considered this. I think she didn't want them to feel managed. Vorax processed that for a long moment. It was, he decided, either a profound leadership instinct or a profound communication failure, and the line between those two things was apparently much thinner than his training had suggested. The sub-zero thermal sequence, Environment 5, started at hour 61. By this point, Vorax had stopped sitting at his monitoring station. He was standing, which was not something he typically did during observation shifts, but the monitoring station seat had started feeling inadequate to the situation. The thermal sequence ran temperatures at -40 standard, with a wind simulation that drove the effective exposure index considerably lower. It was designed to test core temperature maintenance under sustained cold stress, and it was, in the program's history, the environment with the second highest single elimination rate, behind only the final combined scenario. Doza Muriel was in genuine difficulty here. The synth had evolved in ammonia-rich atmospheres that were cold by some standards, but not like this, and her bioluminescent sac had gone the particular pale, almost white shade that her species' physiology produced when it was focusing all available resources on core maintenance and had nothing left over for color commentary. She was moving. She was functional, but Vorax noted that she had slowed considerably, and her biometrics were showing the particular compression pattern of a being whose body had started rationing. Ogun half-mast was, conversely, completely fine. Torvali ran warm naturally, and the cold sequence was, for him, if anything, a relief from the heat stress of Environment 3. He had even, at one point, removed his outer thermal layer for 11 minutes before the monitoring AI sent him an advisory suggesting he reconsider, which he had complied with reluctantly. Pilar Ven had, somewhere between Environments 4 and 5, acquired a heating element of completely mysterious origin and installed it in her boot insoles. Nobody investigated this because nobody felt the investigation would be productive. Maril Okafor Strand was shivering. Vorax noticed because the biometric feed flagged it. Involuntary muscle activation, full body, rhythmic. And he looked it up because at this point he was looking everything up. And he found that human shivering was not a malfunction. It was the body generating heat through rapid muscle contraction. A passive thermogenesis system. An emergency response that ran automatically without any conscious input. The body was cold, so the body started its own furnace. Her core temperature held, not comfortably. The biometrics showed it fluctuating, dipping, recovering, a continuous negotiation between environmental stress and biological response, but it held within the functional band for 63 continuous minutes until the environment cycled. She crossed the thermal sequence finish marker with her teeth chattering audibly through the comms channel, her breath coming in visible clouds, her pace somewhat reduced from her earlier environments, and her eyes completely focused. At hour 72, the final environment began. The combined scenario was not subtle about its intentions. It layered the particulate atmosphere from Environment 1, the humidity from Environment 2, the seismic instability from Environment 4, and the low-temperature elements from Environment 5, not at full intensity, but simultaneously, which created an interaction effect that the program designers had apparently calculated was worse than the sum of its parts. The objective was the same as the first extraction exercise, a weighted platform, 200 kilograms, 3 kilometers to the egress point. Except this time, the cohort was down 1. Dozam Reel had been medically withdrawn at the start of hour 70. Her core temperature response to the thermal sequence having exceeded the program's safety threshold. She was fine. The program's safety thresholds were set conservatively, but she was out, and she had been pulled from the cohort with the particular quiet dignity of a being who had given everything available and had simply run into the arithmetic of biology. That left 5. Vorax watched them approach the weighted platform in the combined environment. He watched Ogun assess it, Ket flank it, Pilar run a route calculation on her handheld, and Myrio Okafor Strand walk to the primary carry handle, set her grip, and turn to look at her cohort. She was, by the biometrics, running on 61 hours without sleep. Her core temperature had been under active stress for the last 11 of those hours. Her cumulative radiation exposure was within safe limits, but on the upper edge, her muscular output indicators showed the particular fatigue signature that meant the body was drawing on reserve capacity. The kind of capacity you were not supposed to use twice. She looked at her cohort. Same as before, she said. Ogun calls it, Ket anchors the rear. Pilar, I want you running recon on the route. Call the seismic events early. Call them early, not when they happen. Pilar looked at her for a moment. You want 30-second prediction windows? 20 is fine. 30 is better. That's technically impossible. Do it anyway, Morel said, without heat, without sarcasm. Just the flat expectation of someone who had decided the word impossible was a starting point for a conversation, not an ending point. Pilar looked at her for another second. Then she pulled out her handheld and started running the seismic pattern analysis that she had apparently been compiling for the last 12 hours and had not mentioned to anyone. They moved. Vorax watched every meter of it. He watched Mirel carry her end of 200 kilograms through layered atmospheric particulate and elevated humidity and intermittent ground movement and thermal stress. He watched her receive Pilar's seismic calls and incorporate them, adjusting the carry direction in the middle of steps with the fluid response of someone who had been doing this in her nervous system for so long it no longer required her brain's permission. He watched her, at the 1 kilometer mark, rotate to the opposite handle position to relieve the muscular load on Ogun's primary grip side without breaking pace or being asked. He watched her, at 2 kilometers, when Ket's forward locomotion momentarily faltered on a seismic disruption, call the correction before Ket processed it, filling the stability gap with her own body position for 4 seconds until Ket recovered. She was, Vorax realized, not completing the Deathworld track. She was conducting it. The egress marker appeared at the end of a long, low ridge of simulated terrain, marked with the program's standard amber beacon, visible through the particulate haze as a warm smear of light in a gray-brown world. Mirel saw it, and Vorax watched her biometrics do something he had not seen in 72 hours of continuous monitoring. Her heart rate dropped, not crashed, dropped. Controlled, deliberate reduction, the kind of thing that happened when a mind decided the threat level had changed and communicated this to the body before the body had confirmed it. It was a regulation response. She was telling her own physiology that this part was over. They set the platform down at the egress marker at hour 72 minutes 41. The monitoring AI logged the completion. It logged all 5 names. It logged the time, the metrics, the equipment status, the route deviation index, the cumulative exposure values. It logged everything with the cheerful impartiality of a system that did not care what any of it meant. Vorax stood at his station and looked at the feed. Mireille Okafor Strand was standing at the egress marker, hands on her knees, breathing in the deliberate controlled pattern of someone who was very tired and had decided to be very tired in an organized way. Her cohort was around her in various states of exhausted collapse. Ogun had sat down with the quiet inevitability of a building deciding to become geology. Ket was doing something that might have been resting and might have been voting on continental drift. Pilar had already pulled out her handheld and was, apparently, documenting something. Elathi walked up beside Vorax and stood there for a moment. "You were saying," she said pleasantly, "something about 1 day?" Vorax looked at the feed. He thought about the personal statement. 4 sentences. Most environments considered inhospitable are simply environments nobody bothered to learn. He thought about 61 hours without sleep. About the thermal sequence and the seismic carry and the radiation navigation and the quiet perimeter that nobody had been told about. He thought about a species that went to low-oxygen places voluntarily, for recreation, to become better at other things later. He thought about shivering as a furnace. He thought about a heart rate that dropped before the threat confirmed it was over, because the mind had already decided. "I was incorrect," Vorax said. Elathi said nothing. She did not need to. On the feed, Mirel Okafor Strand straightened up, rolled her shoulders once, and looked at the beacon. Then she turned and looked at her cohort, at Ogun's vast, exhausted bulk and Ket's immovable silence and Pilar's compulsive documentation, with the expression of someone who had, somewhere in 72 hours of continuous environmental hostility, decided that these specific beings were worth the carrying. Then she sat down next to Ogun in the particulate haze and said, in the matter-of-fact tone she apparently used for everything, "Good carry." Ogun made a sound that was in Torivali the equivalent of a 4-minute standing ovation. Vorax turned off his feed. He had a program evaluation to write. He had, specifically, to write about what he had observed in the last 72 hours regarding one Sergeant First Class, Mirel Okafor Strand, Human, Earth, Specialty Survival Operations and Tactical Endurance. He sat down. He opened the evaluation form. He typed, in the summary field, which had a maximum of 200 words and which he had never previously used more than 40 of, "Recommend for advanced program placement immediately. Note for intake committee. Revise species baseline assumptions for human candidates. Current documentation significantly underestimates functional capacity under sustained multi-environment stress. Specific areas requiring updated assessment. Hypoxic endurance, thermal regulation, environmental pattern recognition, sustained load-bearing, and what I can only describe as the operational habit of treating every problem as information rather than obstacle. He paused. He added one more line. Also, she kept the cohort together without telling them she was doing it. In 41 years of service, I have met 4 beings who could do that. Recommend we find out how many more of them are on that planet. He submitted the evaluation. Outside, in the debrief room at the end of the program track, Muriel Akafar Strand was drinking something hot from a standard-issue thermal container, still in her wet gear, listening to Pilar explain the seismic prediction algorithm she had developed, and looking, for the first time in 72 hours, like someone who had found an environment she was comfortable in, which was, Vorax reflected, perhaps the most remarkable finding of all. The galaxy had spent considerable energy deciding what humans could and could not survive. It had not, apparently, consulted the humans.